I'm no electoral strategist, but surely saying to a bunch of very angry people, the electorate, oh, I'm going to make you more angry, but please don't be angry with me about it, is that necessarily a particularly successful strategy?
And also essentially appealing to the goodwill of a group of people, i.e. the British electorate, who it's pretty clear don't have a lot of goodwill at the moment towards politicians. And there's not many signs that have an awful lot of goodwill towards Keir Starmer either. They're locked into a pretty loveless marriage. It was a negative proposition. I think that is increasingly clear, a negative proposition. They didn't want the other lot, so they've ended up with Keir Starmer and Labour. Obviously that compresses a lot of political diversity into one take, but I do think that's the case. That said, when Keir Starmer was talking about trade-offs, and I thought that was the most interesting section of the speech, he said, if you want...
well, let's work through them. Yeah, let's go through them.
So he said, for example, if you want cheaper electricity, you're going to have more pylons.
Because burying the cables underground is more expensive.
Right. If you want a functioning prison system, more people are going to have to be willing to live near prisons. Okay, hang on, rewind a second. What he's actually just slipped out there is Starmerism means more pylons, more prisons.
Down the road from you.
That's quite controversial.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are going to object to those. Those are quite big calls with absolutely no meat on the bones. That's really interesting. He then went on to say, if you want to be able to return people who've come here illegally, you're going to have to accept that under an asylum system, people are going to come here and stay legitimately. Okay, fine, more asylum claims. That's quite controversial as well. So weirdly, that section, while he was sort of advertising that a lot of this was very difficult and not worked through, I thought he gave us quite clear instincts on some of the thorniest public policy questions. But it does kind of lead you to ask, okay, well, if you know what your instincts are and where you want to go, where's the plan to get there?
I'm glad you mentioned the asylum thing, because my ears really pricked up at the section, which was quite long, about immigration. And he touched on a lot of things, but I suddenly realised I hadn't really heard Keir Starmer talking about immigration in the round, whether it's skilled, unskilled, asylum, just the movement of people across the world. Because up till now, or for the last 2 or 3 years, our entire national conversation has been about small boats, which is a slither of the conversation about immigration. And it was very interesting to hear him broadening that out and having it in more dimensions.
Yeah, because he made very clear, and he has said it before, and he's said it through the election campaign, that he wants to see net migration come down, and we know it's obviously been at record highs in recent years, and the way that they want to do that is by skilling people up and taking the jobs.
But that's always quite a small bit, though, of the conversation, isn't it? It's never like the whole day or a whole speech about the nature of immigration in the modern world.
No, completely right. And actually, I know we do talk a lot about small boats, but it's also worth noting that Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, gave a speech at the conference as well, and her speech was very focused on being the party of law and order, a government of law and order, and small boats featured, I would say, in quite a small way in her speech. She did reiterate their commitment about criminal gangs and all the rest of it, but it wasn't front and centre of her speech either. And with immigration, Sir Keir Starmer didn't go through and articulate a huge train of thought about where he wants to be with immigration in a period of years either. It just hasn't featured very highly. It was much more a focus on, I come back to the point, it was much more focused on a kind of very big picture tone, lacking a lot of the detail about policy. And to be fair, you don't always get huge, great policy plans with loads and loads of detail at party conferences, because a lot of it is about messaging to the people in the room and all the rest of it.
Also, and they have just been elected on a manifesto, so it would be a little bit odd, some of them argue, to suddenly say, oh, here's the big idea we didn't mention during the general election. That's going to blow your socks off.
And some would point to the manifesto as their policy position on some of this stuff as well, because obviously there is some detail in the manifesto
the other
about
thing, just on that immigration stuff, I mean, firstly, and I noticed the reuse of the form of words that Labour latched onto during the election campaign of talking about his previous career as the chief prosecutor, as opposed to the director of public prosecutions, which sounds more descriptive of what he did than something that sounds very, I don't know, lofty and establishment, perhaps. But that extended section may be the longest section of all, actually, on one broad topic, which was the riots over the summer. And that was the jumping off point, wasn't it, for that conversation about immigration.
Which also got him the biggest cheers in the hall, the language he was using around that.
Yes, and using that as a jumping off point for a conversation about immigration where he says control is the central thing, but obviously he sought to draw that line between a concern for that and, as he described it, thuggery and racism and rioting and all the rest of it. But as you say, Henry, on that point as on others, tilting into trying to make a difficult argument against a difficult backdrop, saying it'll take time in an era where there might be a desire for pretty quick solutions, which is quite something. I mean, maybe that's what you can do when you're in your first conference speech and you're sitting on an almighty majority. But then the other thing is, I think we talked about this, Adam, on Newscast the other day, I'm struck by, under the surface of the pride and the celebration at this conference, particularly amongst what you've called, Henry, about the two conferences here, the kind of Westminster on tour and then the wider activists, that kind of vulnerability that they feel because of all of those things and a small share of the vote, considering the scale of their numerical win in seats, and then all of the challenges of trying to address some of the stuff he was talking about today.
It comes back to the point that actually Henry was making before you leapt in about what kind of matters about all of this, of course. Yes, tone matters and all the rest of it, but it's delivery at the end of the day. And back to that point about that, they would acknowledge, I think, that even though they did get a whacking great majority, it's potentially quite fragile for all the reasons that you've set out. And while there may be some public patience, if Sir Keir Starmer keeps articulating the arguments that he is about it's going to be tough, but don't worry, I'm working on it, I still don't have a clear idea about what they think is a kind of acceptable window for when some of this stuff is going to make a direct difference to people. How long they think they've got, how long can they say to people, we know it's tough, but bear with us, before these things start to actually change. And the problem I think they've got is that some of the areas they're talking about are really quite difficult to sort out. Let's be blunt about it. So housing, NHS, public transport, prisons, you could go on and on. They are, and when you take them all in succession, the government says they're all points of challenge. That is a huge lot of work to do. I don't know how long they're giving themselves before they think they've got to start to see some results, as it were.
Newscast from the BBC.